The relentless Arizona sun beat down on Aurora Kane's bare shoulders as she struggled against the rough ropes binding her wrists to the wagon wheel. Sweat trickled down her face, stinging her eyes and mingling with the tears of humiliation she refused to let fall. The crowd gathered for the auction jeered and called out crude comments while the auctioneer's voice boomed across Tombstone's dusty Main Street, describing her as if she were nothing more than livestock. Next up, gentlemen, a fine young woman with plenty of spirit. Good for housekeeping, cooking, and whatever else a lonely man might need. The auctioneer's voice dripped with insinuation, causing the crowd of miners, cowboys, and drifters to erupt in laughter. Caught trying to steal a horse, this one. Sheriff says she's to be sold to cover her crimes and court costs. Bidding starts at $20. Aurora gritted her teeth, rage burning in her chest. She hadn't stolen anything. The horse had been hers, inherited from her father, before he was murdered by the very men who now controlled the law in Tombstone. But a woman alone had few rights in Arizona territory in 1881, especially one whose father had made powerful enemies. The bidding started, voices calling out increasingly higher amounts as men assessed her like they would a mare at a horse auction. $25, $30, $40. Her stomach churned with each bid. The sun beat mercilessly against her skin, and the thirst that plagued her since morning had become unbearable. $50, shouted a heavyset man with tobacco-stained teeth and malicious eyes. Aurora recognized him as Gus Fletcher, owner of the seediest saloon in town. The thought of being owned by such a man made her blood run cold. $55, called another. $60, Fletcher countered, a victorious gleam in his eyes. Untie her. A deep voice cut through the commotion, silencing the crowd. She's mine by choice. The crowd parted as a tall figure strode forward. Vincent McAllister, moved with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to commanding respect. His dark blue eyes surveyed the scene coolly from beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. Dust coated his riding clothes, suggesting he'd just arrived in town after a long journey. "This is an auction, mister," the auctioneer replied, his tone less certain than before. "The lady goes to the highest bidder." Vincent stepped closer, one hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "I said untie her. She doesn't belong to any of you." The auctioneer looked nervously to Sheriff Hollister, who had been overseeing the proceedings with smug satisfaction. "Now see here," Hollister began, pushing through the crowd. "This woman's a thief, caught red-handed." "The law says—" "The law," Vincent interrupted, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous edge, "doesn't permit selling free women as if they were property, no matter what crime they're accused of committing." Aurora stared at the stranger, confusion mixing with desperate hope. She had never seen this man before in her life. Why would he intervene on her behalf? "And who might you be?" Hollister demanded, his hand hovering near his own weapon. "Vincent McAllister. I purchased the old Carson Ranch last month." "Miss Kane here," he nodded toward Aurora, "is my business partner. Whatever misunderstanding has occurred, I'll take full responsibility." Aurora's eyes widened. How did he know her name? The Carson Ranch had indeed been vacant since old man Carson died the previous winter, but she'd heard nothing about a buyer. Sheriff Hollister's face reddened. "We have witnesses who saw her stealing. I suspect your witnesses are as reliable as your sense of justice," Vincent replied evenly. "Now, I'm going to cut those ropes and Miss Kane will be leaving with me. Unless you'd prefer I telegraph the federal marshal in Tucson about how the good sheriff of Tombstone conducts auctions of American citizens." A tense silence fell over the crowd. Aurora held her breath, watching the silent battle of wills between the two men, Finally, the sheriff spat on the ground. "Fine, take her, but I better not see her in town again." Vincent stepped forward, drawing a knife from his boot. With swift, precise movements, he cut through the ropes binding Aurora to the wagon wheel. Her legs, weak from standing for hours, buckled beneath her. He caught her effortlessly, steadying her with a strong hand. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly, his voice gentler than before. Aurora nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Pride made her straighten her spine and take a tentative step. "Yes, thank you, Mr. McAllister." "Vincent," he corrected, keeping a supportive hand at her elbow as he guided her through the dispersing crowd. A magnificent chestnut stallion waited nearby, saddled and ready. "My horse," Aurora began, looking around. "Is at my ranch," Vincent answered, surprising her again, "along with your other belongings." She stared at him, bewildered. "How did you later?" he murmured, lifting her onto his horse before mounting behind her. "Let's leave town before the sheriff changes his mind." As they rode away from Tombstone, Aurora felt the curious stares of townsfolk burning into her back. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this man? How did he know her name, about her horse? Why had he intervened? And most importantly, what did he want from her in return? The desert landscape stretched before them, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Aurora sat rigidly in the saddle, acutely aware of the stranger's body behind her, his arms on either side as he held the reins. "You can relax," Vincent said after they put a mile between themselves and town. "I'm not going to hurt you." "Forgive me if I don't immediately trust a stranger who claims to know me when I've never seen him before in my life," Aurora replied stiffly. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Fair enough. But if I meant you harm, wouldn't leaving you at that auction have been easier?" Aurora couldn't argue with that logic, but she remained wary. "How do you know my name? Your father mentioned you in his letters." This revelation stunned her into momentary silence. "You knew my father, James Kane. We fought together during the war, stayed in touch afterward. When I heard he'd been killed, I came to see if there was anything I could do." Aurora processed this information, wondering if she could believe him. Her father had rarely spoken of his time during the Civil War, but she knew he'd maintained correspondence with old comrades. "If you're a friend of my father's, why haven't I met you before?" "I've spent the last decade in Colorado. Mining, mostly. Your father and I wrote letters, but I hadn't seen him in person for years." Vincent guided the horse around a rocky outcropping. "I arrived in Tombstone yesterday, heard what happened to James, and then learned his daughter was to be auctioned today. The timing was fortunate." "Fortunate," Aurora echoed, her voice hollow. "My father was murdered 3 weeks ago, shot in the back while working our claim. The sheriff called it an accident, a stray bullet from another miner, but it was no accident." Vincent's arms tensed slightly around her. "Who do you think killed him?" Harold Whitley. "He's been trying to buy our claim for months. My father refused to sell." "The silver mine," Aurora nodded. "It's not the richest claim, but it's consistent. We were doing well enough. And after your father died, Whitley tried to take it from you. He offered to buy it for a fraction of its worth, claiming a woman couldn't work a mine alone." Anger colored her voice. "When I refused, suddenly I was arrested for stealing my own horse. They claimed there was no proof it was mine." The horse crested a hill, and Aurora saw a small ranch house in the distance, nestled against the foothills with a barn and corral nearby. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney. "Is that the Carson place?" Vincent nodded. "It's mine now. Not much to look at yet, but I'm working on it." As they drew closer, Aurora noticed fresh lumber on the porch, suggesting recent repairs. The corral held several horses, including to her relief her own dapple gray mare, Athena. She called out, the sight of her beloved horse bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. "Your mare arrived yesterday," Vincent explained as they approached the ranch house, "along with a trunk of personal belongings. My ranch hand, Eduardo, retrieved them from your cabin after hearing about your arrest." Aurora turned to look at him, suspicion returning. "You had someone take my things without permission. Would you have preferred Whitley's men looting your home while you sat in jail?" Vincent countered, dismounting and reaching up to help her down. Aurora hesitated, then accepted his assistance, her legs still unsteady. "No, but, Miss Kane, I understand your suspicion," Vincent said, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "But I promised your father years ago that if he ever needed help, I'd be there. I'm just sorry I arrived too late to save him." Something in his expression, a flicker of genuine regret, made Aurora want to believe him. Before she could respond, the front door of the ranch house opened, and an older Mexican man stepped out onto the porch. "Señor McAllister, you found her, gracias a Dios." The man hurried down the steps, relief evident in his weathered face. "Señorita Kane, welcome. I am Eduardo Vasquez. I have prepared a room for you." Aurora nodded politely, though her head was spinning with the rapid changes in her circumstances. Just hours ago, she had been tied to a wagon wheel, her future looking bleaker than death. Now she stood on a strange ranch with two men who claimed to be helping her out of loyalty to her father. "Thank you," she managed. "I appreciate your kindness, but I need to understand what's happening." "My claim is still yours," Vincent assured her, "but you can't go back there, not yet. Whitley's men will be watching, and the sheriff made it clear you're not welcome in town. So I'm supposed to hide here while Whitley steals everything my father worked for?" Aurora demanded, her exhaustion giving way to renewed anger. Vincent shook his head. "No. We're going to prove your father was murdered, expose Whitley's corruption, and make sure you get justice." He paused. "But first, you need rest and food. We can discuss the details tomorrow." Aurora wanted to argue, to insist they begin immediately, but the events of the day suddenly crashed over her. The sun, the thirst, the fear and humiliation, all of it weighed on her like a physical burden. "Very well," she agreed reluctantly. "Tomorrow." Eduardo stepped forward. "Please, señorita. I will show you to your room. My wife, Maria, has prepared a bath for you and some clean clothes." The mention of a bath nearly broke Aurora's composure. She hadn't been allowed to wash during her 3 days in the town's jail cell. Vincent seemed to sense her emotional fragility. "Get some rest," he said gently. "You're safe here." As Eduardo led her into the house, Aurora couldn't help but glance back at Vincent McAllister. He stood in the yard, removing the saddle from his stallion, his movements efficient and practiced. A stranger who had appeared just when she needed someone, most too convenient to be coincidence, too timely to dismiss. "Safe," he had said. But Aurora Kane had learned the hard way that in the Arizona territory, safety was an illusion that could shatter in an instant. The bedroom Eduardo showed her to was small but clean, with fresh linens on the bed and curtains at the window. A steaming bath waited behind a screen in the corner, and a simple blue dress was laid out on the bed. "Maria's niece left some clothes when she visited," Eduardo explained. "She is about your size. There are more in the trunk." "Thank you, Mr. Vasquez," Aurora said sincerely. "Eduardo, please. Maria will bring you some food after your bath. If you need anything, just call." The older man gave her a kind smile before leaving, closing the door behind him. Alone at last, Aurora sank onto the edge of the bed, the enormity of the day's events washing over her. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't help her situation. She needed to think clearly, to plan her next steps. But first, that bath called to her like water to a person dying of thirst. The hot water soothed Aurora's aching muscles as she scrubbed away the dirt and humiliation of her ordeal. By the time Maria arrived with a tray of food, a hearty stew, fresh bread, and coffee, Aurora felt almost human again, dressed in the borrowed blue dress that fit reasonably well. "Gracias," she said to the kind-faced older woman who set down the tray and fussed with the curtains. "De nada, señorita. You eat, then sleep. Tomorrow is soon enough for troubles." Maria's heavily accented English carried the wisdom of someone who had seen much in her life. After Maria left, Aurora devoured the meal, realizing she hadn't had proper food in days. The sheriff had provided only stale bread and water during her imprisonment. When she finished eating, exhaustion claimed her. Questions still whirled in her mind, but they would have to wait until morning. She crawled into the bed, and sleep took her almost instantly. Aurora woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the scent of coffee and cooking food. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her own cabin, that her father would be sitting at the table when she emerged from her room. Then reality returned, bringing with it both grief and determination. After washing her face and arranging her hair as best she could without proper tools, Aurora made her way toward the main part of the house. She found Vincent seated at a table covered with papers, a coffee cup at his elbow. He looked up when she entered, setting aside the document he'd been reading. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Aurora admitted. "Thank you for the room and the clothes." Vincent gestured toward the stove where a coffee pot sat. "Help yourself." Maria left breakfast keeping warm in the oven before she went to gather eggs. Aurora poured herself coffee, grateful for the rich aroma that promised to clear the remaining fog from her mind. "You mentioned yesterday that we would discuss plans." Vincent nodded, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "I did, but first I want to show you something." He led her to a small desk in the corner of the room and withdrew a bundle of letters from a drawer. "These are the letters your father sent me over the years. The most recent arrived just 3 weeks ago, posted the day before he died." Aurora took the offered bundle with trembling hands, recognizing her father's handwriting on the topmost envelope. "May I?" "Of course." She opened the most recent letter, dated exactly 1 day before her father's death. As she read, her heart raced. "Friend Vince," the letter began, "I fear the situation here has become more dangerous than I initially believed. Whitley's threats are no longer veiled, and his men follow me even to my claim. I've discovered something in the mine, not silver, but evidence. The survey maps have been altered. The richest vein runs not through Whitley's property as he claims, but through land he sold to settlers at inflated prices, knowing it was worthless for farming. He's been buying it back cheap when they fail, but I have the original surveys to prove the fraud." Aurora looked up at Vincent, stunned. "This is why they killed him, not just for our claim, but to keep this quiet." Vincent nodded grimly. "Your father wrote that he hid the original survey maps somewhere safe. Did he ever mention them to you?" Aurora shook her head, trying to remember any conversation that might have provided a clue. "No, but he was acting strangely those last few days. Secretive. I thought he was just worried about Whitley's threats." "The maps would be proof of Whitley's fraud enough to bring him down and possibly implicate Sheriff Hollister as well," Vincent explained. "We need to find them." "But how? The sheriff won't let me back in town, and Whitley's men are probably watching my cabin." Vincent's expression was resolute. "I can go into town freely. No one knows about my connection to your father yet. As for your cabin, Eduardo and I can search it tonight." Aurora straightened her spine. "I'm coming with you. It's my home, and I know every inch of it. If my father hid something important, I'll have a better chance of finding it than anyone else." Vincent studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're right, but it will be dangerous." "My life has been nothing but danger since my father was killed," Aurora replied with quiet dignity. "I won't hide while others fight my battles." A faint smile touched Vincent's lips. "James said you were stubborn. Seems he was right." The mention of her father brought both pain and a sense of connection. "Tell me about him as you knew him, during the war." Vincent leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. "He was the bravest man in our unit, not because he wasn't afraid we were all afraid, but because he never let fear stop him from doing what was right." He took a sip of coffee. "Did you know he saved my life at Shiloh?" Aurora shook her head, hungry for this new knowledge of her father. "We were pinned down by Confederate fire. I took a bullet in the leg, couldn't move. James crawled across open ground under heavy fire to drag me back to our lines." Vincent's voice carried both admiration and old pain. "He could have died a dozen times in those few minutes, but he said later he'd promised my mother he'd bring me home, and James Kane never broke a promise." "That sounds like him," Aurora said softly, tears threatening again. "He always said a person's word was the one thing no one could take from them." They spent the morning sharing stories about James Kane Vincent from the war years and their correspondence after, Aurora from her childhood, and the years working the claim together after her mother died. With each exchange, Aurora felt her trust in Vincent growing. Whatever his reasons for helping her, his affection for her father had been genuine. As noon approached, they turned to more practical matters. Vincent spread a crude map of the area on the table. "Your cabin is here," he said, pointing to a mark about 5 miles from the ranch. "Eduardo says Whitley usually has 2 men watching it. They're not subtle, probably want you to know they're there if you try to return." Aurora studied the map. "There's a back trail here through the wash. It's hard to spot unless you know it's there. My father and I used it sometimes when transporting silver to avoid being followed." Vincent nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll approach that way after dark. Bring only what's essential, we'll have to move quickly." The rest of the day passed in careful preparation. Aurora spent time with Athena, drawing comfort from the mare's familiar presence. Vincent checked and cleaned his weapons, while Eduardo packed supplies they might need. Maria prepared food for them to take, her worried expression betraying her concerns about the mission. As sunset approached, tension filled the small ranch house. Aurora changed from the borrowed dress into her own clothes that Eduardo had retrieved from her cabin: sturdy trousers, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest. Such masculine attire had scandalized Tombstone society, but it was practical for mining work and tonight for stealth. Vincent raised an eyebrow when she emerged from her room but made no comment about her clothing. Instead, he handed her a small revolver. "You know how to use this." Aurora took the weapon, checking it with practiced ease. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. I'm a fair hand with a pistol and better with a rifle." "I hoped as much." Vincent holstered his own weapon. "Ready," she nodded, tucking the revolver into the waistband of her trousers. "Ready." They set out as twilight deepened into night, taking the roundabout trail Aurora had suggested. Vincent rode his stallion, while Aurora was reunited with Athena. Eduardo followed on a sturdy bay gelding. They traveled in silence, each lost in thoughts of what the night might bring. The last rays of sun had disappeared by the time they approached the area where Aurora's cabin stood. They dismounted half a mile away, tethering the horses in a small grove of trees. From there, they proceeded on foot, moving carefully through the scrub brush. Aurora led them to a ridge overlooking the cabin. Below, they could see a small campfire where 2 men sat drinking and playing cards. Just as Eduardo had reported, Whitley's men were keeping watch, but they seemed more interested in their game than in maintaining vigilance. "Not exactly the most dedicated sentries," Vincent observed quietly. "Whitley hires for brutality, not brains," Aurora whispered back. "Those two, Mason and Dutton, they're mean as rattlesnakes but lazy." They worked their way around to approach the cabin from the rear, where the darkness was deepest. Vincent moved with the silent precision of a man accustomed to stealth, and Aurora followed his example, placing each footstep carefully. Eduardo remained slightly behind, watching their backs. The back door of the cabin had been forced open at some point, the lock broken. Inside, evidence of ransacking was everywhere. Furniture had been overturned, her father's books thrown from shelves, dishes smashed on the floor. Aurora bit back a cry of distress at seeing her home violated. Vincent placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently before moving further into the cabin. "They were looking for something," he murmured, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the men outside. Aurora nodded, forcing herself to think practically. "The survey maps, most likely. Where would Father hide something so important?" They began a systematic search, careful not to make noise or disturb anything in a way that would reveal their presence. Eduardo kept watch at the window, alert for any sign that the guards had noticed something amiss. Aurora ran her hands along the underside of furniture, checked behind pictures, and examined the floorboards for signs of looseness. Vincent inspected the chimney, the rafters, and the small root cellar accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, frustration began to set in. Aurora stood in her father's bedroom, trying to think like him. Where would he hide something of critical importance? Her eyes fell on her father's old Bible, one of the few books that hadn't been thrown to the floor. It sat on his bedside table, appearing untouched. Something about its placement struck her as deliberate. She picked it up, running her fingers along its worn leather binding. The Bible had belonged to her grandfather, and her father had read from it every Sunday of her childhood. As she turned it over in her hands, she noticed the binding seemed looser than she remembered. Carefully, she opened the back cover. There, nestled in a hollowed-out section of the thick binding, was a folded piece of paper. Aurora's heart raced as she withdrew it. When she unfolded it, she found herself looking at a detailed survey map with notations in her father's handwriting along the margins. "Vincent," she called softly. He appeared in the doorway, his expression questioning. Aurora held up the map. "I found it." Relief flooded his features. He crossed the room to examine the document. "This is it, the original survey showing the true location of the silver vein." His finger traced a line on the map. "Whitley sold all this land to farmers, knowing it was worthless for crops but valuable for mining. And now he's buying it back for pennies on the dollar," Aurora finished, disgust coloring her voice. A warning whistle from Eduardo interrupted their discovery. Vincent quickly folded the map and tucked it inside his shirt. "Someone's coming," he whispered. They doused the single lantern they'd been using and moved silently to the window. Outside, they could see 3 riders approaching, and they weren't Whitley's guards. The moonlight revealed Sheriff Hollister and 2 deputies. "Out the back now," Vincent ordered, his voice barely audible. They slipped out the rear door just as they heard the sheriff's voice from the front of the cabin. "Mason, Dutton, you two been sleeping. Someone's been in there. There's a fresh horse trail leading right to your post." Aurora's blood ran cold. They'd been careless, leaving tracks visible in the moonlight. "Move," Vincent urged, guiding them away from the cabin toward the wash where they could escape unseen. They had almost reached the cover of the trees when a shout went up. "There they are, by the wash. Run." Vincent pushed Aurora ahead of him as the first shots rang out. They sprinted for the trees, bullets kicking up dust around them. Eduardo stumbled, crying out as a bullet grazed his arm. Vincent turned back, firing his pistol to provide covering fire while Aurora helped Eduardo to his feet. "Keep going," Vincent commanded, continuing to fire as they retreated. They reached the horses and mounted quickly, Eduardo grimacing with pain but managing to pull himself into the saddle. As they spurred their mounts forward, more shots followed them, but the darkness and terrain made accurate shooting impossible. They rode hard for several miles, taking a circuitous route to ensure they weren't followed. When they finally slowed to rest the horses, Aurora tore a strip from her shirt to bind Eduardo's wound. "It's not deep," the older man assured her, though his face was pale with pain. "Barely more than a scratch." "We need to get you back to the ranch," Vincent said, scanning the darkness behind them. "But we can't go directly there. They'll be watching the trails." "There's a line shack about 2 miles east of here," Aurora suggested. "An old prospector named Fergus uses it sometimes, but he's gone to Tucson for supplies. We could wait there until dawn." Vincent nodded. "Lead the way." The line shack was little more than a one-room shelter with a small stove and a pair of narrow bunks, but it offered concealment and a chance to rest. While Aurora tended more thoroughly to Eduardo's wound using supplies from Vincent's saddlebag, Vincent examined the map they'd risked so much to retrieve. "This is exactly what we need," he said, his voice low but triumphant. "With this, we can prove Whitley's fraud. The territory judge is due in Tucson next week. We could take this directly to him." "What about Hollister?" Aurora asked, finishing the bandage on Eduardo's arm. "Once Whitley falls, Hollister will have no protection. Men like him survive only under the shadow of more powerful men." Vincent carefully refolded the map. "The question is, how do we get to Tucson without being caught? Hollister will have men watching all the roads." Eduardo spoke up, his voice strained but determined. "I have a cousin in the Mexican settlement south of here. He could guide you through the desert, away from the main roads." Vincent considered this. "It's risky crossing open desert, but less risky than facing Hollister's men on the road." He turned to Aurora. "What do you think?" The question surprised her. "Most men wouldn't seek a woman's opinion on such matters. I think it's our best chance. Eduardo's cousin, is he trustworthy?" "With my life," Eduardo confirmed. "Mateo knows the desert like his own hand." "Then we'll go at first light," Vincent decided. "Eduardo, you should return to the ranch. Your wound needs proper care and Maria will be worried. Can you make it back safely?" The older man nodded. "Si, senor. I know ways to avoid being seen." They spent a tense night in the line shack, taking turns keeping watch. Aurora found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Each sound from outside set her nerves on edge, and her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. During her watch, Vincent joined her by the small window, his presence somehow reassuring. "We'll make it to Tucson," he said quietly, as if reading her doubts. "Your father's killer will face justice." Aurora turned to study his profile in the dim light. "Why are you doing this? Risking your life for a promise made years ago?" Vincent was silent for a moment. "Your father saved more than my life at Shiloh. He saved my soul." His voice carried the weight of old memories. "I was a different man then, angry, reckless. I'd seen too much death, caused too much of it. I was losing myself to the war." He shifted, his eyes meeting hers. "James talked to me about honor, about finding purpose beyond the fighting. He reminded me there was still good in the world worth protecting. When the war ended, I was lost again. Your father's letters over the years, they were an anchor, a reminder of the man I wanted to be." Aurora felt something shift within her, a deepening of the tentative trust she'd placed in him. "He never told me about this. A small smile touched Vincent's lips. James wasn't one to speak of his own virtues, but in his letters, he often wrote of you how proud he was of your strength and determination, how you were just like your mother. The mention of her mother brought a familiar ache. She died when I was 15. Fever took her in 3 days. I know. James wrote to me afterward. His grief was profound, but he also wrote of how you held him together during that time. Vincent's eyes held a gentle understanding that made Aurora's carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. I miss him, she whispered, the simple words inadequate to express the depth of her loss. Vincent's hand covered hers, warm and steady. I know, and I promise you his death will not go unanswered. They remained like that, hands clasped in silent understanding, until the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky. As the others stirred, Aurora realized something had changed between them, a connection forged through shared grief and common purpose. With the new day came renewed determination. They parted ways with Eduardo, who would take a roundabout route back to the ranch. Vincent and Aurora headed south, toward the small Mexican settlement where they hoped to find Eduardo's cousin Mateo. The settlement consisted of a cluster of adobe buildings nestled against the foothills. Mateo Garcia proved to be a lean, weathered man with keen eyes and a cautious manner. He listened to their story without interruption, examined the wound in Eduardo's arm, then nodded once. I will guide you, he said simply. But we must leave within the hour. A storm is coming from the south. We should be ahead of it. They took time only to purchase additional supplies and water. By mid-morning, they were traveling across the open desert, following a route known only to their guide. Mateo led them through washes and rocky terrain where they would leave minimal tracks, always alert for signs of pursuit. The journey was arduous. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the water in their canteens grew warm and unpalatable. Aurora rode without complaint, though her body ached and her skin burned despite the kerchief she had tied over her head for protection. Vincent rode beside her when the terrain permitted, occasionally passing her his canteen when hers ran low. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, watchful for any sign of danger. By late afternoon, the sky to the south had darkened ominously. The promised storm was approaching faster than anticipated, black clouds building like mountains on the horizon. We must find shelter, Mateo called back to them, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. There is a canyon ahead with caves. We can wait out the storm there. They pushed their tired horses harder, racing the advancing wall of dust and rain. The air grew thick and charged, the smell of ozone sharp in their nostrils. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, they reached the mouth of a narrow canyon. Mateo led them to a shallow cave set into the canyon wall, barely visible behind a stand of scrubby trees. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses inside as the storm broke in earnest. Rain fell in blinding sheets, and lightning split the sky with blinding forks. We are fortunate, Mateo said, surveying their shelter. This cave stays dry even in the worst storms. They made a small fire near the entrance, more for light than warmth in the desert evening. The horses were hobbled at the back of the cave, where they munched contentedly on the sparse feed they'd brought. As night fell outside, punctuated by the continuing storm, Aurora found herself sitting beside Vincent, watching the play of firelight on the cave walls. Mateo had moved deeper into the cave to sleep, giving them an illusion of privacy. You think they're still looking for us? Aurora asked, keeping her voice low. Without doubt, Vincent replied. Whitley knows what that map could mean for him. He won't give up easily. He added a small branch to the fire. but Mateo's route will keep us well away from where they'll be searching, and the storm will wash away any tracks we might have left." Aurora nodded, trying to take comfort in his confidence. "And when we reach Tucson, what then?" "We take the evidence to Judge Morrison. He has a reputation for integrity, one of the few honest officials in the territory." Vincent turned to look at her directly. "After that, it's your decision. You could reclaim your father's mine, rebuild. Or—" Aurora sensed there was something more he wasn't saying. Vincent hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Or you could sell it. Start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without painful memories." "Is that what you would do?" His eyes held hers steadily. "I've learned that running from memories rarely works. They follow you wherever you go." "You sound like you speak from experience." Vincent looked back toward the fire, his expression distant. "After the war, I drifted from place to place, trying to outrun what I'd seen, what I'd done. It took years to realize the only way forward was to make peace with the past, not escape it." Aurora studied his profile, seeing the lines of old grief etched there. "Is that why you bought the Carson Ranch? To stop drifting?" A small smile touched his lips. "Partly. James mentioned in his letters that it was for sale, said it was good land, just needed the right hands to work it." He paused. "I thought perhaps it might be a place to put down roots." Something in his tone made Aurora's heart beat faster. "Alone?" Vincent turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw an emotion that both thrilled and frightened her, a tentative hope, carefully guarded. "That depends," he said softly. Before Aurora could respond, a crack of thunder shook the cave, startling them both. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a possibility acknowledged but not yet explored. They fell into silence, watching the storm rage outside their shelter, each lost in private thoughts about paths that might converge. The storm continued through the night, finally abating near dawn. They emerged from the cave to find the desert transformed, puddles of water standing where dust had been, the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet earth. Their journey resumed, now through mud that sucked at their horses' hooves, slowing their progress. Mateo estimated they would reach Tucson by nightfall if they pushed hard. As they rode, Aurora found herself studying Vincent with new awareness, noting the strength in his hands as he guided his horse, the watchful intelligence in his eyes, the quiet authority he carried without arrogance. She had known him only days, yet in that brief time he had risked his life for her, shown her kindness when she most needed it, and given her hope when despair threatened to overwhelm her. These were not small things. Midday, they stopped briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold meal. As Aurora stretched her aching muscles, Vincent approached with his canteen. "How are you holding up?" he asked, offering her water. "I'll manage," she replied, taking a grateful drink. "I've ridden harder trails with my father." Vincent nodded, his expression appreciative rather than doubtful. "Your father said you were tougher than most men he knew. I'm beginning to think he undersold your resilience." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "What will you do after Tucson? Return to your ranch?" "That's my plan," Vincent confirmed. "There's much work to be done to make it productive." Aurora handed back his canteen, their fingers brushing briefly. "It's good land, the Carson place. The creek never runs dry, even in summer. So I've been told." Vincent hesitated, then added, "I could use a partner who knows the area, the seasons, someone with experience." Aurora's breath caught at the implied offer. Before she could respond, Mateo called out a warning. Riders were approaching from the northeast, 6 of them, moving fast. "Hollister's men," Vincent muttered, quickly moving to untie their horses. "They must have picked up our trail after the storm." They mounted hastily, abandoning the remains of their meal. Mateo led them into a series of ravines, hoping to lose their pursuers in the complex terrain. For a time, it seemed they might succeed. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter behind them. Then disaster struck. Mateo's horse stepped into a prairie dog hole hidden by mud, going down heavily. The guide was thrown clear, but the horse screamed in pain, its leg clearly broken. Vincent dismounted quickly, helping Mateo to his feet. "Take my horse," he urged, but Mateo shook his head. "No, senor. You must get to Tucson with the senorita and the map. I will stay with my horse." He drew his pistol. "I can delay them, give you time." "We won't leave you," Aurora protested, but Mateo was resolute. "You must. Eduardo is my blood. I promised him I would see you safely to Tucson, and Mateo Garcia keeps his promises." His weathered face softened. "Go, follow the ravine south. When it ends, head west. You will see the Catalina Mountains. Tucson lies before them." The sounds of pursuit grew louder. There was no time to argue. With heavy hearts, Vincent and Aurora continued on, leaving Mateo with his injured horse and his pistol. Minutes later, they heard gunshots behind them. 1, 2, 3, then silence. Aurora felt tears sting her eyes, but she rode on, knowing that to stop would make Mateo's sacrifice meaningless. They rode hard through the afternoon, pushing their horses to the limit of endurance. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they finally caught sight of Tucson in the distance, a cluster of buildings nestled in the shadow of the mountains. "We'll make it," Vincent said, relief evident in his voice. They had just emerged from the last stretch of rough country onto a more traveled road when 4 riders appeared ahead, blocking their path. Sheriff Hollister sat astride his horse at the center, his badge catching the light of the setting sun. "End of the line, McAllister," he called, his gun already drawn. "Hand over that map, and maybe I'll let the lady live." Vincent and Aurora reined their horses to a stop, trapped between the sheriff ahead and his deputies, who would surely be following behind. "How did you know about the map?" Vincent demanded, buying time as he assessed their options. Hollister laughed unpleasantly. "You think Whitley doesn't have eyes and ears everywhere? One of my deputies heard you talking at that line shack." He leveled his pistol. "Now the map. I won't ask again." Aurora saw Vincent's hand inch toward his gun. It would be suicide 4 against 1, with Hollister already armed and ready. "Wait," she said suddenly, an idea forming. "I have the map." Vincent glanced at her sharply, but she gave him a meaningful look. Understanding flickered in his eyes. "It's in my saddlebag," Aurora continued, slowly reaching toward the leather pouch. "I'll get it for you." Hollister's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Careful, girl. No tricks." Aurora opened the saddlebag, making a show of searching through it. With her body blocking Hollister's view, she slipped her hand to the small revolver hidden in her waistband. "Here it is," she said, straightening. In one fluid motion, she drew the gun and fired. Her aim was true. Hollister jerked backward, his shot going wild as he clutched his shoulder. In the moment of confusion, Vincent drew and fired in rapid succession, hitting one deputy in the arm and causing the others to scatter for cover. "Ride!" Vincent shouted, spurring his horse forward. They galloped past the wounded sheriff, who cursed and shouted orders to his remaining men. Bullets whistled past them as they rode hard for Tucson, now visible in the dying light. Aurora's heart hammered in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She had shot a man, the sheriff, no less. There would be no going back now, no possibility of quietly reclaiming her father's mine. Everything had changed in that moment of desperate action. They reached the outskirts of Tucson as darkness fell, slowing their exhausted horses to a walk. The streets were crowded with evening traffic, miners coming off shift, respectable citizens heading home for dinner, cowboys looking for entertainment. "We need to find Judge Morrison immediately," Vincent said, his voice low and urgent. "Hollister won't be far behind us, wounded or not." They asked directions to the judge's residence from a passing townsman, who directed them to a modest house on the eastern edge of town. As they approached, they saw lights burning in the windows, suggesting the judge was at home. Vincent dismounted quickly, helping Aurora down from her horse. They must have presented a wild sight, dusty, disheveled, and clearly exhausted when the judge's housekeeper answered their knock. "We need to see Judge Morrison," Vincent explained. "It's a matter of life and death." The housekeeper looked doubtful, but a deep voice from within called out, "Who is it, Mrs. Perkins?" "Travelers, Your Honor, say it's urgent." A tall, silver-haired man appeared in the hallway behind her. Judge Terrence Morrison had the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the harsh Arizona climate, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Come in," he said after a moment's observation. "Mrs. Perkins, please bring our guest some water." They followed the judge to a simply furnished study, where he listened without interruption as they explained the situation: James Kane's murder, the altered survey maps, Whitley's fraud, and Sheriff Hollister's corruption. When they finished, Vincent carefully unfolded the map they had risked so much to retrieve. Judge Morrison examined it thoroughly, his expression grave. "This is serious evidence of extensive fraud," he said finally. "Combined with the murder of Mr. Kane and the attempted illegal sale of his daughter, it warrants immediate action." "Hollister and his men are not far behind us," Vincent warned. "And they're desperate." The judge nodded, moving to his desk to write a brief note. "I'll send for the federal marshal. He's in town for the circuit court session." He handed the note to Mrs. Perkins, who had returned with water. "Take this to Marshal Brennan at the Grand Hotel. Tell him it's urgent." As the housekeeper hurried out, Judge Morrison turned back to them. "You'll both stay here tonight under my protection. The marshal will want your formal statements in the morning." Aurora felt relief wash over her, followed quickly by a new anxiety. "Judge Morrison, I shot Sheriff Hollister. He's wounded, probably not seriously, but..." The judge held up a hand. "Self-defense, against a corrupt official attempting to obstruct justice. I wouldn't concern yourself, Miss Kane." Vincent gave her a reassuring glance. "The judge is right. Once Whitley's fraud is exposed, Hollister's crimes will be clear as well." Judge Morrison offered them a simple but hearty meal, followed by the first comfortable beds they had seen in days. Despite her exhaustion, Aurora found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with thoughts of all that had happened and what might lie ahead. A soft knock at her door roused her from her restless contemplation. She opened it to find Vincent standing in the hallway, similarly unable to sleep. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said quietly. "As all right as can be expected," she replied, stepping back to allow him to enter. It was improper, perhaps, but propriety seemed a distant concern after all they had been through together. Vincent remained near the door, respecting her privacy. "Tomorrow will be difficult. The marshal will have many questions, and Whitley's influence extends even to Tucson. But we have the evidence, and Judge Morrison believes us," Aurora pointed out. "Yes, but justice in the territories can be unpredictable." Vincent's expression was troubled. "I want you to be prepared for whatever happens." Aurora moved closer to him, drawn by the genuine concern in his eyes. "I've been facing unpredictability since my father died. At least now I'm not facing it alone." Something shifted in Vincent's gaze, a warmth that had nothing to do with their precarious situation. "No," he agreed softly, "not alone." For a heartbeat, it seemed he might say more, might close the small distance between them. Instead, he stepped back. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." As he turned to leave, Aurora caught his hand. "Vincent." He looked back, his expression questioning. "Thank you." "For everything." He squeezed her hand gently. "No thanks needed between friends. Friends." The words seemed simultaneously too much and not enough to describe what had grown between them in the brief, intense days of their acquaintance. "Good night, Aurora," he said softly, releasing her hand. "Good night." After he left, Aurora returned to bed, finding sleep came easier now. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with courage, and she would not face it alone. Morning brought Marshal James Brennan, a taciturn man with hard eyes but a reputation for incorruptible justice. He took their statements separately, questioning them in detail about the events leading to James Kane's death, the fraudulent survey maps, and their confrontation with Sheriff Hollister. By noon, telegrams had been sent to authorities in Tombstone, ordering Hollister's arrest and the seizure of Harold Whitley's business records. Judge Morrison assured them that federal agents would investigate the altered survey maps and the land fraud scheme thoroughly. "What happens now?" Aurora asked as they sat in the judge's study. The immediate crisis passed, but the future still uncertain. "You both should remain in Tucson for a few days," Marshal Brennan advised. "We may need additional testimony once Whitley and Hollister are in custody." "And after that?" Vincent inquired. The marshal shrugged. "That's up to you. Miss Kane, your father's claim is legally yours. Once this matter is settled, you'll be free to return to it if that's what you wish." "If that's what you wish." The words echoed in Aurora's mind as she considered her options. The claim had been her father's dream, not hers. She had worked it with him out of love and loyalty, not passion for the silver it produced. Judge Morrison provided them with rooms at Tucson's finest hotel for the duration of their stay, refusing their protests with a wave of his hand. "Consider it the least the justice system can do after your ordeal." That evening, Aurora stood on the small balcony of her hotel room, watching the sunset paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of gold and rose. She heard a soft knock and opened the door to find Vincent, freshly bathed and shaved, wearing clean clothes purchased that afternoon. "The hotel's dining room is quite good, I'm told," he said. "Would you join me for dinner?" Aurora had also taken advantage of the hotel's amenities, washing away the dust of their journey and changing into a simple but elegant dress provided by the judge's wife, who had taken a motherly interest in her situation. "I'd like that," she replied. Over dinner, they spoke not of Whitley or Hollister or the dangers they had faced, but of simpler things, books they had read, places they had seen, hopes they harbored. It was the first normal conversation they had shared, untainted by immediate peril. "Tell me about your ranch," Aurora said as they lingered over coffee. "What do you plan to do with it?" Vincent's eyes lit with enthusiasm as he described his vision. "Cattle, yes, but also horses." He had a gift for training them, he explained, a patience developed during his years of drifting after the war. "The land has good water, decent grazing, and enough varied terrain to challenge a horse without breaking it," he said. "Eduardo has already helped me begin repairs on the barn and corrals." "It sounds like a good plan," Aurora said, genuinely impressed by the thought he had put into it. Vincent hesitated, then asked the question that had been suspended between them since their conversation in the cave. "Would you consider visiting when this is all settled, to see the improvements?" Aurora met his gaze directly. "Is that all you're asking me to consider?" A slow smile spread across Vincent's face, appreciation for her directness evident in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "It's not all." "Then ask me properly," she challenged gently. Vincent leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Aurora Kane, I've known you less than a week, but in that time I've seen your courage, your determination, your loyalty, and your heart. I find myself hoping for a chance to know you better, away from danger and pursuit, to see if what's growing between us might flourish in peace as it has in turmoil." His honesty moved her deeply. "I'd like that chance too," she replied softly, relief and pleasure mingled in his smile. "Then you'll come to the ranch when this is over?" "Yes," she said simply. "I will." 3 days later, word arrived from Tombstone. Harold Whitley had been arrested trying to flee across the border into Mexico. Sheriff Hollister, his wound treated, was in federal custody, along with 2 of his deputies. The evidence from Whitley's office had confirmed the massive land fraud scheme, and additional charges of conspiracy to commit murder were pending. Marshal Brennan informed them they were free to leave Tucson, though they might be called back to testify at the trials. "What will you do about your father's claim?" Vincent asked as they prepared to depart. Aurora had given this considerable thought during their days in Tucson. "I'm going to sell it," she decided, "to honest miners who will work it properly. My father loved that claim, but for me, it holds too many painful memories now." Vincent nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And after," she smiled, the first truly unburdened smile since her father's death. "I thought I might visit a ranch I've heard about. I understand the owner is looking for a partner who knows the area." Joy lit Vincent's face, but he maintained a deliberate casualness. "Is that so? And would this visit be temporary, or might the lady consider a more permanent arrangement in time?" "That," Aurora replied, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, "would depend on the gentleman in question, and whether his actions continue to match his words." "A fair condition," Vincent agreed, taking her hand. "I can only hope to prove worthy of her consideration." They left Tucson the following morning, traveling at a leisurely pace compared to their desperate journey there. The landscape that had seemed hostile during their flight now revealed its harsh beauty under the winter sun. When they reached the canyon where they had sheltered from the storm, they made a detour to search for Mateo. To their great relief, they found him alive, though wounded, being cared for in a small Mexican settlement nearby. He had survived his encounter with Hollister's men, though his beloved horse had not. Vincent purchased a new horse for the guide, insisting it was the least they could do to repay his courage. Mateo accepted with dignity and promised to visit them at the ranch once he had fully recovered. The ranch house came into view on a clear, cold afternoon 5 days after leaving Tucson. Eduardo and Maria rushed out to greet them, joy and relief evident on their weathered faces. "Gracias a Dios," Maria exclaimed, embracing Aurora as if she were a long-lost daughter. "We feared the worst when you did not return." Eduardo, his arm still bandaged but healing well, clasped Vincent's hand firmly. "The news has reached even here," he said. "Whitley arrested, the sheriff in chains. Justice for Senor Kane at last." "Yes," Vincent agreed, his eyes finding Aurora's across the yard. "Justice, and perhaps something more." The following weeks were filled with work and planning. Aurora rode with Vincent to her father's cabin one last time, gathering personal belongings and saying a private goodbye to the place that had been her home. The claim was sold to a partnership of 3 miners who had worked for her father in better times, men she knew would honor his memory through their stewardship of the silver mine. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm of hard work and simple pleasures. Vincent and Eduardo repaired fences and outbuildings, while Aurora helped Maria tend the kitchen garden and make the house more comfortable. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues. It was on such an evening, nearly 2 months after their return from Tucson, that Vincent asked Aurora to ride with him to a ridge overlooking the property. The spring air was mild, scented with wildflowers that had erupted across the desert floor after recent rains. From the ridge, they could see the ranch house below, smoke curling from its chimney, and beyond it, the vast expanse of land that comprised the ranch valleys, rocky outcroppings, stands of mesquite, and the ribbon of green that followed the creek through the property. "I brought you here because I wanted you to see it all," Vincent said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "What it is now and what it could be." Aurora turned to look at him, sensing the importance of the moment. "It's beautiful, Vincent." He took her hand, his eyes holding hers steadily. "When I bought this place, I thought I was finally putting down roots after years of drifting. But now I realize a place alone isn't enough. It's the people who share it that make it a home." Her heart quickened as he continued. "Aurora Kane, I love you. These past months have shown me that what began in crisis has grown into something true and lasting. I'm asking you to share this land with me, this life to build something lasting together." Tears blurred Aurora's vision as joy welled within her. "Are you asking me to marry you, Vincent McAllister?" A smile lit his face. "I am, with all my heart." "Then my answer is yes," she said simply, her voice steady despite the emotion filling her chest. "I love you, and I want nothing more than to build a life with you." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of the future they would forge together. As the sun set behind them, painting the land in gold, Aurora knew that the pain of the past would never fully vanish. But it had led her to this moment, this man, this chance for happiness. Their wedding took place that June, a small but joyful affair attended by Eduardo and Maria, Mateo and his family, Judge Morrison, who had become a friend, and the miners who had purchased James Kane's claim. Aurora wore a gown of cream-colored silk ordered from San Francisco, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony on the ranch house porch, his dignified voice carrying across the yard as Vincent and Aurora exchanged vows and rings. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers, and Eduardo's nephews fired their pistols into the air in traditional celebration. The trials of Harold Whitley and former Sheriff Hollister concluded that autumn, resulting in long prison sentences for both men. Aurora testified, facing her father's killers with the quiet strength that had seen her through so much adversity. Vincent stood beside her throughout, his support unwavering. With justice served and the past finally laid to rest, Aurora and Vincent focused fully on their future together. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Vincent's skill with horses became known throughout the territory, bringing buyers from as far away as California and Texas. Aurora discovered unexpected joy in ranch life, the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of working alongside her husband, the freedom to build something that was truly theirs. The nightmares that had plagued her after her father's death gradually faded, replaced by dreams of the future. Their first child, a son they named James after both her father and Marshall Brennan, was born the following spring, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's determination and his father's thoughtful eyes. He was joined 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Vincent's mother. As the years passed, their ranch grew and prospered. The house was expanded to accommodate their growing family. Eduardo and Maria remained with them, becoming grandparents in all but blood to the children. Mateo visited often, bringing his own children to play with James and Elizabeth. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Vincent took Aurora back to the ridge where he had proposed. The view had changed, more buildings dotted the landscape now. Green pastures had been carved from the desert, and a herd of horses grazed peacefully in the valley below. "Did you ever imagine this?" Aurora asked, gesturing to the thriving ranch. When you cut me free from that wagon wheel in Tombstone." Vincent smiled, lines of happiness crinkling at the corners of his eyes. "I imagined many possibilities that day," he admitted. "But the reality has surpassed them all." Aurora leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "When I think of how close we came to never meeting if you hadn't received my father's letter, if you hadn't arrived in Tombstone that day." "Some things are meant to be," Vincent said simply, his arm tightening around her waist. "Your father knew that, I think. In his last letter, he wrote that he hoped I would find my way to Arizona someday, that he had a feeling we would suit each other." Aurora looked up at him in surprise. "He never told me that." Vincent's smile was tender. "James Kane was a wise man in many ways." "Yes," Aurora agreed, thinking of her father with love rather than pain for the first time in many years. "He was." They stood together as the sun set, painting the desert in the same fiery hues as on that day a decade earlier. But now they watched it not as two people tentatively exploring newfound feelings, but as partners who had weathered hardship and joy, building a life rich with love and purpose. As darkness fell, they returned to the house where their children waited, where lamps glowed in windows, and where the future continued to unfold, a future that had begun in desperate circumstances, but had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring in the harsh, magnificent land they now called home.